Okay, we're live.
All right. Let me just see our participants.
So far we have 10. We can wait a little bit.
Okay.
But I know that, Zorhan, you only have an hour, right?
I don't, I actually only have until 6:30.
Okay, all right, well, we'll make it work.
Community board waits for no one.
Yes,
So.
yes. Ruchi says hi, Austin.
Yeah, I see. Hi, Ruchi.
Oh, they're coming in.
What's our magic number? You want to hit 50 and then
That's
start?
the magic dragon, yeah, 50.
All right, perfect.
And then the rest will trickle in. Professor, one of your students says hi.
No, that's actually an attorney, Joseph.
Oh, okay.
Mario, yeah. Can I say hi back?
I mean, you could, or just wave.
Y'all know I'll wave. He works with the
Working families?
No. With individuals who have been disproportionate, who have been wrongfully convicted.
Ooh, okay.
And expunging their records. So a lot of his work he does out of Manhattan. So we have been working closely together with various organizations that connect his legal expertise to them.
Expungement, okay.
Yeah, and so that's why when we talk about expungement, to me, it takes on a very different characteristic when we, all the bureaucratic red and loops that these individuals have to go through in order to get their records either expunged or sealed becomes problematic. And
yes, I'm very curious to see how this new law is going to work.
Yeah.
This automatic stuff. I already had some conversations with people about it that.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's almost like Reaganomics never trickles down to, it never trickles down. And so you might hear me say that we started off with these great policies, but it never makes it to the populations or to the NYPD. So let me leave that there for now.
Right, but I don't want to, do I care about being politically correct now? After today, I don't think so. But the body that has to actually expunge the records, right, is an official body. And there's people that plug in codes or don't plug in codes. It really determines whether or not someone's record gets expunged.
Back to the algorithms that are developed by, that says, and if you have to go back to who the algorithms are developed by, and this is the same thing when we talk about licenses, who qualifies for the programs for license in this very conversation. How do they get at the practical at? So
right.
Austin, you'll see I'll get kind of
Austin, we're at 50, the magic number. Do your thing. You're muted.
Okay. It always helps when I'm not muted. All right, should I start recording?
It's already recording.
Oh, okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're all digesting the Chauvin news, the guilty verdicts on all counts. But this is a good, safe environment for us to really talk about some of the issues that are underlying that case and many other cases. So thank you for joining us. We're gonna get started on time because this is ACLU and I want everyone to get the full 1.5 hours of credit. My name is Austin DeSouza. I am president-elect of the South Asian Bar Association of New York. I'm very proud to convene tonight's event on behalf of Sabani, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association, the New York County Lawyers Association, and with the support of virtually every bar association of color in New York and the NAACP Midtown Manhattan branch. Welcome to 420, Civil Rights and Marijuana Legalization. Tonight's event came about because my dear friend Asha Smith and I were talking about the civil rights movement, as one does, that we are living in now, and how activist groups like Black Lives Matter have brought issues of social, economic, and racial justice to the foreground. They have shown through perseverance and moral conviction that if we're going to have any meaningful change, we cannot wait. We have to step up to this moment. This is also true for lawyers who represent communities of color. That's us. We have to step up to lead the bar, not just of our own bar association, but every bar association. In every court, every law firm, in every political office. We can't wait for others to invite us to become judges or partners because that day will never come. Now is our time. This is our moment. But in order to get there, we must work together in solidarity. Whether it's anti-Asian violence or racist policing against Black and brown people, we must stand up for each other. At work, we must help each other succeed, hire and promote other people of color, and groom the next leaders. Let's put attorneys of color, particularly women of color, on our panels because all of us shine brighter when we shine together. Of course, I'm just one voice, and this is not about me. I'm taking my inspiration from leaders from bar associations of color who have been doing this for years, and I'm grateful for their co-sponsoring tonight's event. As you can tell, this is not just any old CLE. This is about solidarity, about bar associations of color coming together to show that we are the leaders and we are the experts. We have to disrupt the narrative that attorneys of color are going to wait our turn or defer to others, particularly when it comes to issues that are about our communities, such as tonight's issue. We have to show up and occupy the space of leadership because we don't need anyone's permission. Tonight's diverse panel of experts reflects this paradigm. So too will other events we are organizing. On May 4th, we are holding an event titled Justice and Communities of Color, a civil rights forum with Manhattan DA candidates, where all the Manhattan DA candidates will be questioned by a panel made up of attorneys and other experts of color. We'll be announcing that event soon, so stay tuned. Now, tonight's event is very important when it comes to civil rights and communities of color because New York is, after all, the marijuana arrest capital of America. New York's war on drugs means we arrest more people for marijuana here than anywhere else. But the so-called war on drugs was never about getting rid of drugs. We know that because whether it's marijuana, heroin, or cocaine, all of these things have been accessible to people of privilege. When they want an elevated experience or relief from pain, they make a call and they get a delivery, just like they were ordering pizza. When they want drugs, the police look the other way, because our society is built on the idea that only certain people are entitled to compassion. If you're Black or brown and you want to use or sell drugs in the street level market, there's consequences waiting for you. You're dangerous, you're a criminal, and you've ruined your own life. But if you're white, there's compassion and it's someone else's fault. That's because the war on drugs is really the war on Black and brown people. Now, I'm not editorializing here. We know this because of the evidence, which is overwhelming. If you're ever looking to get high on knowledge, like I always am, I put together a CLE packet of materials that you can easily refer to when you're looking up data. You'll find that over 94% of inmates incarcerated for drug offenses in New York are Black or Latinx. That's in 2020. Police only look for drug offenders in Black and brown neighborhoods, so it's no mystery that they don't find drug offenders in other neighborhoods. America's drug laws appear neutral, but are enforced in a profoundly racist way. The impacts are as deep as they are unforgiving. Young men in particular enter into a vicious cycle of drug dependency and recidivism. Children grow up without their parents and themselves enter the carceral system without a way out. Education in communities of color is chronically underfunded. Arrest records close the door to high-paying jobs. Voting rights are taken away. Life insurance and bank accounts are inaccessible. Housing applications get rejected. The list goes on and on. The war on drugs is just part of a larger structure that criminalizes color. Our system of enforcing and prosecuting crimes is a system of soft apartheid that divides and dehumanizes people of color and tells them that their lives just don't matter. Now, on March 31st, New York's drug policy dramatically changed when Governor Cuomo signed into law the Marijuana Regulation and Tax Act, MRTA. It capped off an 8-year effort by Assembly Majority Leader People Stokes and Senator Liz Krueger to legalize adult marijuana, recreational marijuana. The law creates a legal cannabis market and an equity program to assist those who were disproportionately impacted by drug laws that want to participate in the industry. The new market is expected to bring in $350 million in taxes per year and create up to 60,000 new jobs. However, concerns persist. The law empowers police to continue to conduct traffic stops based on the suspicion of marijuana use, virtually guaranteeing future cases like Sandra Bland, George Floyd, and others that started as pretextual traffic stops. It's also clear whether the bill will actually benefit poor communities of color, because let's face it, nothing good has ever trickled down to the poor. I'm looking at you, Professor Coffey. Asha and I have called together a panel of experts that will discuss where we've been in the fight for drug legalization, where we are today, and what the future may hold. Tonight, we get to hear about New York's new law, how it compares to the one recently passed in New Jersey, and about innovative approaches to drug policy in other states like Oregon. Now on to the speakers. You'll find full biographies in the CLE materials, but I'll briefly introduce our panelists. We're fortunate to have Assembly Member Zorhan Mamdani join us tonight. He was elected just last year and is the first South Asian man elected to the Assembly. Before taking office, he fought for low-income families against foreclosures and evictions in Queens as a community organizer. He voted for the MRTA and will give us insight into the legislative process and discuss the prospects for future progress. Theshia Naidoo is Managing Director for Legal Affairs at Drug Policy Alliance, an organization that has been at the forefront of the battle for reforming America's drug laws. She is an expert on criminal justice aspects of drug policy reform and with a focus on all drug decriminalization. She was one of the leaders who laid the groundwork for Oregon's landmark Measure 110, the nation's first all drug decriminalization measure. Amol Sinha is Executive Director of ACLU New Jersey, and he was instrumental in getting marijuana legalization passed in New Jersey. He also is a past president of the South Asian Bar Association of New York. He will help us contrast New York's bill with our neighbors and talk about New Jersey's rather unorthodox path to legalization. We have Professor Terence Coffey, who teaches forensic justice at New York University. The law on drugs isn't just academics for Professor Coffey. It has touched his life in a profound way, and his lived experience inspires his other work. He is the founder of Educate, Don't Incarcerate, which works to guide formerly incarcerated students. You'll find me tuning in to Professor Coffey's weekly talk show, It's Coffee Time, at 4 p.m. on Thursdays, where he discusses issues related to criminal justice reform. Last but never least is Asha Smith, who is moderating tonight's event and who I think of as a panelist because of her background as a former public defender, where she litigated everything from low-level offenses to complex high-level felonies. Asha wears many hats, though she's not wearing a hat today. She's a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University. She's a relentless advocate for criminal justice reform. She has many leadership roles with NYCLA, the MBBA, and the New York State Bar Association. And you'll find her on TV as an on-air analyst discussing criminal cases of national interest. I'm thankful to call her a friend and co-conspirator when it comes to making good trouble, such as events like this, which would not have gone from idea to reality without Asha's guidance and advice. Let me go over some logistics. We'll stop our discussion around 7:15 for question and answer. Then within 24 hours after the event, you'll get an email directing you to fill out a form to get CLE credit and evaluate the event. If you don't see it, check your spam folders. Please fill out the form as soon as possible. It'll take about 2 weeks from tomorrow to get those CLE certificates to you. You'll need a CLE code when you fill out the form, which I will give you as we make our way through the program. For my friends who are hearing impaired, I will post the code in the chat. Lastly, I want to thank the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association and its president, Nigist Abebe, for sponsoring tonight's event so that we could make it a free CLE. Take it away, Asha.
Thanks, Austin. And Zorhan, I know you only have a little bit of time to spend with us, but I wanted to start out the conversation about talking about the new legislation in New York. Why now? Why into 2021 when we've been talking about this for a while?
Well, I've only been in office for about 3 months, so I haven't been present for the length of the fight, though I would say I've been personally invested in this issue for a long time. I think that, there's a number of reasons. If you want to get into the kind of politics of it, it's that neighboring states had been legalizing marijuana and New York was being left behind, not only in a moral sense, which we've been left behind for a long time, but on a fiscal and economic sense, which seems to move a lot of my colleagues sometimes more so than moral arguments. And I think that the way that Austin was framing this discussion is really apt in terms of will justice trickle down? Will it ever trickle down? And thinking about the specifics of this legislation. All of that being said, however, I would still say that the legislation that we did pass and that has been signed into law by the governor is actually much better than what would have been had this been any other political year. And what I mean by that is that the political realities of our governor, one who is meshed in every which kind of scandal that you could ever imagine, means that between the CRTA, which was his vision for marijuana legalization as he spelled out in his executive budget, and the MRTA, which was the vision of the legislature, this final proposal is much closer to the MRTA. And I think the reason for that is because of the fact that the governor's hand was significantly weakened publicly and privately because of his actions over the last few years.
Oh, well, too bad for him and good for us and and our communities. Was there great opposition to this bill?
I think there was significant opposition. The interesting thing about one of the many lessons I've learned about politics in Albany is that what you see in public is in many ways predetermined. It's performance, right? If a bill reaches the floor, it means that a decision has been made that the bill will pass. So what we see vis-a-vis floor speeches and what people have to say, it's all with the final decision already being determined. And so I think that you can see the opposition just in the amount of years it took to get to the floor and the amount of time and false starts that occurred in New York State. And I think that to add to what I said previously, I think that frankly, it's not just that the governor had a weaker hand and so this proposal turned out better. I think the fact that he had a weaker hand to play means that this proposal actually came to life, because otherwise he's not above just killing an idea and waiting even longer until he gets his way. And so I think that that might also be part of the fact that we're celebrating 420 in a legal way, or at least, it's Ramadan, so I'm not, but I would be otherwise.
And we know that it's projected to bring in a lot of money to New York State. Do you think that played into why it was passed, especially with what happened in the last year, given the pandemic?
I actually don't think that played as much of a role, because I was part of the group of legislators who've been advocating vociferously for raising taxes on the wealthy across our state. And we intentionally left this out from the idea of revenue raisers. We talked about this, when we did talk about this, it would be through the frame of justice as opposed to the frame of revenue. Because once again, it's what we're trying to do here is remedy a historical injustice and set up a legal market, but it's not setting up a legal market that happens to do the former. And so it's, this year, New York State also legalized, mobile sports betting, is in the process of figuring out what that will look like. Again, that was something that was kept kind of at an arm's length from the discussion about revenue raisers, because there's also the question of what is actually progressive taxation versus what is a sales tax.
Right.
I'm trying to keep those two as different discussions.
Well, if you can tell us this, when there was discussion about passing this bill and the recognition, was there recognition of the economic impact that happens to communities of color when, formerly, and still some are incarcerated, I think, for for marijuana related offenses, like what that does to an entire family, what that does to an entire neighborhood. And in terms of economic retribution, was there any thought about that in Albany or?
Absolutely. And I think that the thought about that, obviously there are some legislators who bring that thought, but I think that a lot of it also comes from advocates, in the sense of there is a benefit of not being the first, although I would always argue for us to be the first in leading something, which is that you get to learn from the lessons and the mistakes that are occurring across the country as people attempt to legalize marijuana. Yeah. And I think that this legislation, the reason that there are such clear intentions vis-a-vis where the money will go that's raised from revenue, and who will get first priority in actually being able to attain that revenue, and what does expungement look like? The reason for those kinds of stipulations is because of the work of advocates and because of the work of other states and because of the work of legislative leaders like Majority Leader Crystal Peoples-Stokes to ensure that we're not going to just allow the urgency to legalize mean that we leave so many people behind for whom this is a matter in many ways of life and death. And I can just speak a little bit from personal experience here. The criminalization of marijuana, it truly ruins people's lives, and it is, how do I put this? It's part of a war on Black and brown individuals and an attempt to reduce us to Black and brown bodies. Right. And it doesn't exist separate from other state violence. I went to high school with someone who was arrested a couple times for marijuana related offenses, and after the third was pressured by the police to become an informant in their attempts to surveil Muslim New Yorkers, right? So these things do not exist separate. They come together, and it's just another arm of the state in enforcing the marginalization of certain groups. And so I think that it's so important to me that we do not leave that understanding behind, and that we use that knowledge of state violence to inform the way that we actually move forward on this issue.
And I want to sneak this question in because it's tangentially related. Penal Law 22003 is the possession of controlled substance, and there's many convictions for that. It's not the same thing as marijuana, but in terms of the effect on someone's life for having a conviction for that, where the newly enacted marijuana law is going to allow for expungement of marijuana convictions, even one conviction for another substance. And I'm not advocating necessarily for the sale of these substances, but I'm thinking ahead to like the possible expungement of these kind of offenses too, because they, like you say, they do impact someone's entire life. Do you know if that's being considered, or has anyone ever raised that issue in Albany, even though it's.
I can't speak to if it's been raised before, just because of the brevity of my time there, but as of now, in terms of active discussion, I haven't heard it. I mean, personally and politically, I fundamentally believe in the decriminalization of drugs. I just do not think that, given the history of this state and who this state targets, I think it would be extremely naive for us to believe that any of these laws would be applied equally, and that they would be separate from the history of violence that is based and targeted on race. Right.
So basically, we have another fight on our hands. Okay.
We have many fights on our hands.
Right. And that's fine.
And I would say that should be the standard posture towards all politicians, myself included, is that we can never rest on our laurels, because there's just so much we have to address just from the past to even start thinking to move forward to the future.
Right. Professor Coffey, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I am very honored and happy to be here to be involved in this conversation. And Asha, really to go back to what the statement that you just made in regards to code, 220.
Controlled substance, you can just say that. You don't have to give a number.
When we really look at it, 203, it's really when we start talking about the criminal possession of a controlled substance in the 7th degree. Now, we have to truly understand, when you look at that legislation or that code, one of the things that you also mentioned, and as the Assemblyman mentioned, as far as that goes. The fact that they said a criminal possession, if you read further, it talks about syringes and all these things and being harmful, this yada yada. But I want to bring it back because that will have to be looked at, because under this new legislation that the possession of 3 ounces or less would not be criminalized. Now, again, as we were talking in the back door, for me, and for those communities I represent, that somehow, even from the legal perspective, never, ever trickles down to practice within Black and brown communities, period. New York, New Jersey, Texas were the 3 states with the highest number of arrests since 2010. And so this is when we talk up to 2018. So we can talk about and this is even at the point of having medical marijuana legalized. So during this whole period of time, the arrest rates amongst Blacks and brown were still going on as business as usual. So who this applies to is critically important to what needs to be implemented and discussed in these conversations. And we can go on that, a list of things of that. Like I said, this is like, to me, anytime I hear something happening at the top, my initial instinct is Reaganomics. Do we believe it trickled down to the bottom, to those individuals that this is supposedly supposed to benefit? And secondly, in regards to what the Assemblyman said, one of the things that I understood that the complications surrounding the legalization of marijuana here in New York State had nothing to do so much so with what the PTA said, with the idea of health and safety concerns. It had nothing to do with, I think it was a Republican assemblyman who said, public safety and all this stuff. What it really came down to is, how do we address and deal with the Black and brown people that we have historically incarcerated? How do we make retributions or reparations to? How can we say we've done this over the years? Now we're going to legalize with over thousands of Black and brown bodies who have been incarcerated. That's where the sticking point came in. And we saw this in New Jersey when under their social equity access plan. That was another aspect where was a sticking point for them, because even till today, they have not worked out how that actually looks in practical terms of those directly impacted communities benefiting from the so-called equity plan that was implemented and based upon that was used to pass the legislation. And we've done that here now in New York.
Well, Amol, can you talk about what Professor Coffey talked about in New Jersey? Can you talk about that?
Sure, happy to. Thank you to Sabani and the MBBA and all the other bar associations that are co-sponsoring this for having us. Well, let me just, since this is a panel that we're hosting very soon after the verdict of Derek Chauvin, let me just say one thing about that, and then we'll continue to. First of all, as folks probably recognize, the guilty verdict is something that may provide a sense of accountability for what happened. However, it's not anywhere close to what we need, right? It's just a small piece of a bigger puzzle, and true justice is far off and the work continues. But it's not wholly unrelated to what we're talking about here today, because it's those relatively minor, quote unquote, police interactions that escalate and lead to the tragic outcomes that we saw in George Floyd's case and in countless other cases. And too often it's Black folks that are bearing the brunt of that. And we see that every day here in New Jersey too, where just over this past weekend, there was an incident in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, where kids were arrested for riding unregistered bicycles in Perth Amboy, and of course it gained a lot of buzz.
Is that a real law?
Supposedly, there's a registration in municipalities that requires people to register their bikes. putting aside, Asha, whether or not something like that should be criminalized, even if it is, how is it being enforced, right? And what we're seeing more and more is that those are the sorts of things that are enforced against Black and brown folks and not against white folks. And thankfully, the kids that were arrested were incredibly skilled advocates for themselves and people that captured every single thing, every single minute on video. It shouldn't have to be that way, but that's the only way we got accountability or a sense of, not even accountability yet, but a sense of transparency around what happened, and hopefully we'll get some accountability there. But
just
in any case,
the conversation their parents must have had with them already,
yeah,
for them to be that prepared.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. And we were seeing in New Jersey over 30,000 arrests for marijuana possession annually, and that number had escalated over the course of the past several years. So we did a report, the ACLU of New Jersey did a report based on 2013 data a few years back. And at that point, we were like, man, this is a huge problem. We are making about 23,000 arrests annually, and Black folks are 3 times more likely to be arrested than white folks. Fast forward to 2019 when we revisited data from 2018, and sure enough, not only did the raw numbers of arrests increase, we were seeing over, I think at that year, 36,000 arrests for marijuana possession. So it increased by over 10,000 in that period of time. Black folks were now 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession than white folks. And that, to me, was unconscionable, because this was after we had a governor that was campaigning on marijuana legalization from a social justice perspective. We have a thriving medical marijuana industry in New Jersey, and we have advocates and other folks that have been calling for legalization. And we have all of these industry types coming together to talk about what legalization could look like in New Jersey, wearing suits, talking about supply and demand and incentives and creating and zoning and things like that, when every single day we were seeing more and more people getting arrested. So the social equity component that Professor Coffey was mentioning certainly was a key part of this, right? Like we have been calling for, with our partners at BPA and elsewhere, we have been calling for legalization from a racial justice center for a very long time. We first started in earnest talking about legalization, I would say, in 2014 at the ACLU of New Jersey, meaning, it had always been a policy goal of ours, but in 2014 we started building the infrastructure for it and advocating for legislation. And so to answer your question, Asha, about the social equity components of the bill that we eventually passed, and I'll get to the circuitous route of how we got there a little later, but there are several social equity components that I think are worth noting. And of course, a lot is yet to be seen about how it's actually implemented, but here's what it says on paper. So we have about 70% of a sales tax going towards a social equity fund that's going to be directed towards what the state calls impact zones. And these are communities that have been hit hard by the war on drugs and have other metrics that make it identifiable as economically ignored for a long time. And let's face it, these are Black and brown communities in New Jersey, right? Socioeconomic status and race are inextricably intertwined, and that's where some of this money is going to go. On top of that, there is a social equity excise fee on cultivators that's going to be going to the same fund. So we're going to see more money going to those communities. Whether or not that social equity excise fee is assessed and how it's assessed is going to be up to the Cannabis Regulatory Commission in New Jersey, which was just seated recently, the chair of which is Diana Wainu, who is a former ACLU of New Jersey employee and somebody that we have some faith in that will actually lead with racial justice at the forefront of her work. Other things to note that make New Jersey, I think, a leader in this space is that there are some good, not great, but good provisions to ensure a diverse industry. And I think there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of room for the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, who's going to be making the determinations about licensing, to actually lean into making sure that we have diversity in the industry. And that includes the fact that there's no barrier to entry for people with criminal convictions. So while we had asked for a specific carve out for people with criminal convictions, we didn't get that. But there's at least no barrier to entry, meaning that nobody is categorically denied a license simply because they have a prior conviction. So that's a good thing. And we also see good things in the way it treats policing, in that, no longer can police use the odor of marijuana to conduct a search. And that's really exciting, because I think
that's always in the complaint.
Yeah, and it's so subjective, right? And that's something that police use all the time for pretextual stops to get to other things.
Bionic noses.
Yeah, and so I think that piece is actually the main piece that's going to kind of transform policing as we know it in communities of color, if it's adhered to. Of course, the skeptic in me will say that police will find a way, right? They will always find a way. But at the very least, on paper, we have something that takes away a tool that they've used for a very long time to oppress communities of color. And the last thing I'll note is that it's really progressive in the way it decriminalizes cannabis and the way it treats youth who are seen with cannabis. So the decriminalization scheme, which is, of course, legalization sets up the industry and allows for people to buy and sell. Decriminalization dictates how much you can have on you at any one point without getting arrested, right? And so in New Jersey, what we're seeing is now you are allowed to possess 6 ounces of cannabis without any criminal or civil penalties attached to it. So it effectively legalizes possession of 6 ounces. And the same applies for youth as well. So youth won't be arrested for possession of cannabis. However, there's an escalating, I see the skepticism in your eyes.
Because I saw a news story about some kids and the police were like, well, we want to tell your parents. And there's like, no, for what? Because it's not a crime.
Exactly. So that was the compromise that we got, right? Like, so we had said from the get-go that what we don't want to see is kids interacting with the police more frequently, because what we saw in Colorado, for instance, was that in the aftermath of adult use legalization, the thing that was still easy was for police to go after kids, because that still remained illegal.
And that's another target, especially for Black and brown kids. That
exactly.
Start that, and that would be another discussion about getting the police out of schools. But I don't interrupt you.
No, absolutely. That's worthy for discussion as well. But the thing that we asked for was to eliminate police interaction with kids, but where we landed was this escalating warning scheme. So in the first instance, if a kid is found with marijuana, they're going to get a verbal warning and a call to their parents. Second instance, there's a written notification to parents and some information about social services sent to the parents. And then a third instance, it's a referral to a social service agency of some sort where they'll follow up. So it's better than having kids interact with police about, and get arrested. But of course, we also understand that any interaction with police could escalate and lead to a tragic outcome. So this is one of those spaces that we'll have to monitor carefully to see exactly how it's being implemented.
And I know you have to leave, Zorhan, but do you have anything else to add before you have to go to your city council meeting?
It's a community board meeting.
Sorry, yes.
I bring it up because it's part of the MRTA, is that when
definitely got to go to that.
When a dispensary wants to come up in the neighborhood, they have to go before the community board. So I can only promise to everyone listening that those will become even more exciting in the years to come. But I mean, the thing I would just add is that I think that so much of the promise of this legislation will or won't bear fruit based upon the decisions of the board that is still yet to be constructed. And so what, there's obviously marijuana has been legalized immediately, but in terms of the legalization apparatus of how it will be sold, and all of the exact breakdowns of the money that will be spent on education, the money that will be spent on those who've had to go through the system, all of these kinds of things, which I think are really worth celebrating. We should only really truly celebrate them once this board has followed through on the intent of the legislation, because the legislation is crafted with a racial justice lens. But as I think New Jersey has shown and so many other states, there's a long way between intent and the passage of something and the creation of a board that actually implements that intent in a tangible way. And so I think that to everyone who's here as a part of this panel, thank you all so much for the work that you've already done on this issue, and to everyone who's listening. And it's just that now for us, the battle, especially as legislators, is to make sure that we don't consider marijuana to be a completed issue, but rather an issue in progress.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Theshia, you've been silent just because I haven't reached you yet, but I know you have a lot to add to the conversation. So
thank you so much, Asha, and thanks to all of the co-sponsoring associations who are putting on this really timely discussion. I'm happy to talk about, Oregon and decriminalization, but just to add to what the other panelists have said in the context of marijuana legalization, in some of the earlier legalization efforts, like in Colorado, in terms of even just people who could get licenses to be a part of the industry, the people with prior drug convictions were excluded. And in subsequent legalization schemes, we've learned from those mistakes, and California was the first legalization ballot measure that specifically addressed some of these equity considerations and explicitly said, if you have a prior drug conviction, marijuana conviction, you're not going to be excluded from the industry. And I think California also explicitly wanted some equity goals. So in terms of reinvesting in communities most harmed by drug prohibition, there was this concerted effort. A lot of it was left to the local level. And so we have some key cities like Oakland or San Francisco that had some model equity policies. So as you're implementing New York's legislation and certainly New Jersey's, there are some really innovative models at the local level that people can look to. And then I'm actually going to pivot a little bit away from the marijuana legalization discussion, if that's okay with everyone. I feel like where we are right now with 17 states having fully legalized for recreational purposes together with DC, there's going to probably be some movement at the federal level. We're at the point of almost a tipping point when it comes to marijuana legalization. Close to half of the country lives in a jurisdiction that has legalized. And so what I want to do is just step back and think, what's next in the evolution of drug policy? I fully agree that with marijuana legalization, there are lots of issues, especially in the equity context, and who's benefiting from legalization, who's continuing to be criminalized. So there are lots of questions that need to be urgently addressed. But in terms of like the new wave and the new frontier, I want to actually talk about all drugs. So drugs other than marijuana.
Yes, I tried to sneak that in there a little bit, but take it away.
Okay, is that okay, or should I wait?
No, it's perfectly fine. Like,
okay. Okay, thanks. So, when you look at drug possession arrests in the United States, it's about approximately 1.6 million arrests for just drug possession in the US. That translates to about 23 seconds. There's one arrest every 23 seconds. It's also just, disproportionately, as we all can imagine, these are Black and Latinx and Indigenous and low-income people. It's basically the number one way that these communities come into contact with the law and with law enforcement. And, thanks, Amol, for acknowledging the Chauvin verdict. But, as we reckon with like racism and policing, we really need to look at ways to limit police contact with communities and eliminate those opportunities for arrest that so many times lead to disastrous consequences. And so talking about, drug possession specifically, the arrest for drug possession or even a conviction for drug possession is not just that limited loss of liberty for the period of time that somebody gets a drug conviction. Those consequences last a lifetime in some instances. And if you're an immigrant, it would cause you to be ripped away from your family and deported to a country that you might have no connection with. But there are also other consequences of having a drug conviction, including loss of housing, loss of, like your employment opportunities could be impacted, family obligations, child, parenting obligations. So I'm not going to go down that line, but what I want to say is that the racial disparities in the system of arrests in drug law enforcement follows communities of color beyond just the incarceration. So I just wanted to put that framing out there. And so what we, at Drug Policy Alliance, we've been thinking through, what's next after marijuana legalization, and looking at this issue of drugs being used as a reason to stop, search, target communities of color, and how can we eliminate that from the equation? And so we worked on a ballot measure in the state of Oregon that was successful this past November, in the November election, that essentially decriminalized the possession of any drug for personal use. And at the same time, expanded investments in treatment and harm reduction and other services that are necessary for people who might be using drugs and need services.
And there was a weight requirement or weight limit in the statute, right?
So, yes, there are weight cutoffs for each substance. And that's the distinction for law enforcement. It's like if it's below the cutoff, you can't arrest someone for possession of below the weight cutoffs. And so moral of the story is, so we have a model in Oregon. Of course, it's the first of its kind. It was a ballot measure, so it reflected political reality. So there'll be lots of lessons learned from Oregon as we try and replicate this in other parts of the country. And as with the marijuana legalization discussion, just learning with what happened in Colorado, there are going to be, certainly things in the Oregon model that we're going to learn from and move forward from. But this is really the first step, I think, in a long evolution of drug policy reform. And it's heartening to see that there's actually a place in the US that has taken the step. And then since then, there have been about 8 states that have introduced legislation just in this year that would do something similar in terms of decriminalizing possession of all drugs. So I'll pause there, and I know
Professor Coffey wants to jump in.
Okay.
Yeah. I thank you so much, and I love numbers, and I was listening to Amol share, and let me share this from not only my academic or my professional perspective, but that lived experience. When we talk about the ongoing impact of what an arrest means for a young Black male in this country, or a Latino, that outside of, and I'm gonna thank you for at least being forefront with the idea of what's put on paper does not matriculate in Black and brown communities, period. We can, stop. For any, so I always have to make that clear. I looked at the Oregon, I was looking at Oregon's social equity program, and part of that program stated that I think it starts off with the businesses having $750,000 and something about in income from the previous year, and then the following year you can have no more than 2 licenses, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, I look at this work from a real practical perspective. I look at it, that young man who getting out, they got these programs that are under, particularly here in New York. And let me say that because under our equity program, the main part I was focusing on, it's the idea of access to 30 to the 60,000 jobs that this would produce. That's my first thing. The second concern that I have is when we began to talk about the community, I think it's the community grants and reinvestment funds, which 40% of government revenue will go to programs. And I'm with you, Tashida, you're gonna kill me if I get your name wrong. But I looked at Oregon, I looked at a few other states, and one of the most, even in New Jersey under Phil Murphy, I looked at California. California has probably the most comprehensive equity program that can be applicable to the population here in New York State. That speaks to the needs. When we talk, because when we talk about this, for me, one of the things someone said, the players that are in the game right now are organizations like Acreage Holdings that already has procured one of the license from New Jersey at $10 million. Now, I don't know if y'all know like I know, but I ain't got 10 million to sit on. And when we start talking about these programs and those individuals who are ensuring that people, when we say communities that are directly impacted, let's not get that confused. In our legislation here in New York, there's a aspect of that if I'm not mistaken, Austin, that has funding that will go to farmers. Now, I understand the need for farmers, but I do not see farmers as those being directly impacted. I never went to the bullpen and saw a farmer there waiting to go to, I just never saw the farmer. I'm just going to be honest with you. What I did see was a bunch of black and brown faces. So if that money is being utilized to expand the work of farmers or cultivation, I'm with that. But let's not put it under the title or banner of directly impacted. That just doesn't coincide with what.
So basically, you see problems already.
Yeah, I see it already because even in, when we talk about who has, who will approve license, who will do the trainings like they do in California. California has broken it down as it was shared by jurisdictions for those areas. We got 5 boroughs. I mean, here in New York City, I'm just talking about New York City right now. That money, when we think about those areas hardest hit, California has took those funds and allocated to each one of those areas throughout the state that were hardest hit. They have the training programs, the license assistance program, the et cetera, et cetera. And that shows a clear path to accessing the cannabis industry. It's important to me that as we have this conversation in New York State and I will say, quote, one of the most progressive states in the union, quote, I put that in that it's important that we understand the implications of what this means financially, and I am going to say financially, to Black and brown communities.
I feel like they don't have the plan yet. Like I feel like
I don't think they have a plan yet. I think, and I support it, and I believe in what Senator Liz Kruger did in supporting the equity portion of this legislation. But what I do not think that was in place was a constructive plan as to how do these funds get to these communities. Can we set up training programs and classes in those communities? What does that look like? Do we have teachers of color who are going to come in and help cultivate where that money is going into those communities? Do we have those? What's the list of what's the criteria for some of the loans and grants for these young men and women and people who have been impacted? Because historically, we already know as Black folks and minorities, when we start talking about loan applications and who gets approved and who doesn't get approved. So I like the deal with Amol shared that we need someone on that selection committee that's representative of those communities. And I think that puts this in a more practical terms and understanding that makes, hopefully, and I like what the gentleman said, hopefully provides us with an opportunity to really use this legislation, since this is what it was sold on to the general public. You know, we're going to really support those disadvantaged communities and, you know, hardest hit communities. That's what we sold it on. But we also sold legal gambling in this state as well. Remember when we said Lotto was going to come in and the billions of dollars were going to go to educational programs in the hardest hit communities? And somehow when I go to those local schools in our communities, the revenue that the government said that would be allocated to educational programs in those disadvantaged communities, I don't understand why we still have our teachers asking for funding to get pencils or utensils for our students. I don't understand when we talk about our schools in those hardest hit communities still not having aftercare programs, et cetera, with the $1 billion of windfall. So I do not want our communities to get lost in the shuffle, or with this, as Malcolm X said, to get bamboozled in this process. And that's where I stand.
Good point. So it's basically that the community organizers and community at large have to step up the game, right? We really can't just rely on Albany to.
We must ensure and hold those legislators accountable to what we have now put on paper. I think that New York can even go further in creating a community investment plan. A lot of times they see our Black and brown communities as the consumers, the workers, the et cetera, et cetera. What happens when we create an investment plan that African Americans or communities can invest in the cannabis industry? Why aren't we being trained? Why isn't that a part of it? And that's one of the things I like to pose, you know, with the governor or whatever legislation. I want to see an investment plan that provides.
Why don't you draw out the plan so we can shop it and get it done? Because
okay, Asha, I just
talk about it. Are you already started? You already started?
No, you already know I'm already on point with that. So those are some of the things and as I said earlier, I want these conversations, particularly with our listeners and our audience and those who will see this, that they have a clear understanding and a practical understanding of what's happening with the legalization of marijuana. We already, and I shared on my show, to expunge a young Black or brown man's record without giving that individual access to the educational and economic windfall that this legislation is going to bring is an insult to our communities if that does not happen, mainly on the fact that what they held out for and what they were struggling with was how do we deal with this impacted community. So it's important for me that we see this in practical terms. We see portions that 40%, the 40 acres and a mule, y'all know I'm talking now. You got to understand that language. Ensure that that 40 acres and a mule goes to those communities that were directly impacted, and that we ensure that we hold those legislators, community groups accountable for what we have all agreed upon in signing off on this legislation.
We're at the beginning, so I feel like we have the chance to create the narrative and create the infrastructure that we want to see. I don't really know about the lottery situation. Like in the back of my mind, it makes sense because I do maybe kind of sort of remember hearing about the lottery situation, but I don't like really pay that much attention to it. But like this, I think directly impacts so many communities of color that we need to all pay attention to it.
Exactly. And that's why you'll always hear me say, I do not want our communities, our activists, those who are on the front line, particularly those communities, to get lost in the shuffle of these conversations. And we're back to Reaganomics. It sounds good on paper. We can put an infrastructure in, but we want to ensure that that money, those monies and those funds go to those hardest hit communities, and those individuals and communities have access to these grants, these loans, these trainings, these abilities to access license, to set up dispensaries in Black and brown communities. Why do we have to go on the east side to have a dispensary that we're saying that we're going to flood money to address the poverty that impacted the communities of color that we're discussing tonight? And that's my main objective, ensuring that happens here.
Sounds like a conversation we need to continue to have, and maybe we need to talk to some people out in California to see how they implemented everything.
Yes,
I
that
knew
was
we
wonderful.
were going to talk about Oregon, but I want to hear more about California too, but let's talk about Oregon.
Actually, can I just quickly add to something that
yes.
I just said? So, I mean, I agree 100% implementation is critical and we need to hold our legislators accountable. There needs to be, you know, really a watchdogging role to make sure that equity is centered in all of the implementation decisions, so 100%. I also want to clarify that when I was speaking about Oregon, I was talking about all drug decriminalization, so not the marijuana legalization law or implementation. I can't speak to that issue, and I know the professor was referencing the Oregon equity provisions, and I'm not in a position to speak about it because I'm not familiar with that. Regarding California and some of the equity elements that was centered, I mentioned Oakland and San Francisco as being potential jurisdictions to look at, but Oakland has been amazing in terms of giving priority licenses with very specific criteria targeting people who have been, disproportionately targeted for arrests and prosecution in the state, but certainly in Oakland. I mean, licenses have to be affordable. If you have to pay $20,000 to get a license, who's going to be able to afford that? It's like you don't want big business and industry to come in because those are the ones that can afford it and can navigate these complex rules to get a license. So that what you also need is technical assistance. So groups that have been historically left out, well, the legacy market people. So legacy market meaning all of those people who've been criminalized before legalization, they should be the ones to have priority access in this legalized market, yet they're being kept out of it because they are like structural barriers. So, there should be loans. I mean, Oakland had set up a loan, like interest-free loan for people who want to get into the industry and prioritizing the equity applicants. So I think that there are some good models to look at and adapt to New York and New Jersey and anywhere else that might be considering, how to implement this the right way.
I like the idea of loans, but I also know that a lot of times in communities of color, there's a predatory aspect that enters into the picture. So we would still want to have some oversight over the loan process for actually getting these licenses, just because history tells us that, there's what's on paper and then what's not on paper. I mean, redlining still goes on, so.
And that criteria, and that's another thing that I as we move forward in this conversation, I think it'll be important for all of us here to understand what that criteria is for those loans. Is it because as soon as, I deal and I've worked with a lot of young men, and, when they say, well, you can only have one conviction that was ... and anything outside of that, you're done. There's not one young Black man who has been impacted by our criminal justice system, particularly having marijuana, that doesn't have some type of charge tagged to him with another charge that has a record that would disqualify that person. There are communities that would be disqualified. So I think that in creating that criteria for those individuals who would meet the requirements for those loan and grant applications, we make that criteria in a way that meshes with those communities to provide the truest opportunity for equity and equality in this sphere of this conversation.
And Amol, what are you seeing in New Jersey in terms of equity? And I know you talked about it briefly before, but I want to come back to you because it's a neighboring state and you guys implemented the law before.
Yeah, well, the law is not yet fully implemented. So where we're at right now is the nascent stages of it all. And we hope that when we do fully implement the law, meaning when we have an industry up and running, it'll be more equitable than not equitable. But that's that's a question mark, and it all depends on how it's going to be regulated by the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. What I am hopeful about is that, like, as I mentioned or alluded to before, the process to get to legalization in New Jersey was a long and circuitous one.
Right.
And that's because in 2019, the legislature had a bill that there was, long story short, there was a lot of energy around it. And there were a lot of people in the advocacy space and elsewhere that were supporting it. So the ACLU of New Jersey said yes to that bill and said, let's move it forward and get it done. But then in the Senate decided in our state that we didn't have the votes to get it through. And so we didn't have the votes, and therefore we were going to kick it to the ballot in 2020. And then there was a ballot question, and we ran the campaign at the ACLU. We ran the campaign for the ballot question, and we won the ballot question by a bigger margin than any other marijuana ballot question in the country. So we got 68% of the vote in New Jersey. We won all 21 counties in New Jersey, which is, really rare.
Right.
And that was a big deal for us. And then we still needed legislation to implement the ballot question. And so it's a weird circuitous route because most other states don't operate in that way. You still need what they call enabling legislation to implement the ballot question.
Right.
And so that's when all of these conversations started happening about what the bill should actually look like, what are the equity provisions, what are the tax provisions, et cetera. Initially, we saw a bill that was first introduced that reserved all of the cannabis sales tax money and said that it would go to police. And we said, no, you can't do that because that's going to be a real problem. You're investing in the reason why we have to legalize in the first place, right? The reason we're legalizing is because of the over enforcement of marijuana prohibition by law enforcement, and to how sort of hypocritical and insulting would it be to take all of the money that's built on the backs of criminalized people of color and then give it back into law enforcement that will further criminalize people of color.
And so watch you too, New Jersey.
Yeah, we got to watch New Jersey too. Though the things that I'm hopeful for is that there's going to be a bit of a participatory process in the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. So the Cannabis Regulatory Commission is going to hold public hearings throughout the year, where they will actually seek input from the community on key issues as they build regulations. So, and that includes where specifically the money should go when it's going towards those impact zones that I mentioned earlier. So where in those impact zones should the money be going? And my hope is that the Cannabis Regulatory Commission will hold multiple hearings within communities to say, look, Paterson, New Jersey, it's an economically underdeveloped community. It's defined as an impact zone, and it's a largely Black and brown community, and it's been ignored for decades, and it has a whole host of issues with law enforcement. And we want to hear voices, not from the ACLU, but from the residents of Paterson. Where should the money be going? Where are those tried and true places, whether it's housing or education or whatever it might be, where the money is actually going to help individuals and communities to achieve its goals. So hopefully we'll see a cannabis regulatory process that's going to take into account community voices before it makes decisions on behalf of those communities.
And Amol, I thank you for that. And again, I want to reiterate, and I get a lot of things from my individuals I work with, and we've had few regulatory committees that never adhered to the voices of our communities, that never took into account our communities. What usually happens is that those decisions are just made for our communities as opposed to with our communities. So and particularly with the Cannabis Regulatory Committee being made up of individuals not from our communities. So it is my hope that a subcommittee could be made from individuals within the community, leaders, teacher, however that may look, that will advise the Cannabis Regulatory Committee on what's taking place and ensuring that some of the measures that are brought forth to them are implemented. Because it's one thing for you to come and listen when I said, then I can say on paper, see, we went and we held the great thing, we listened to the community and we went and did what we wanted to do, what we was going to do anyway from jump. So I think that for me, when I hear that, and trust me, I'm still in support of when we hear all that's trying to be done to reach us to that goal. I am concerned about those communities who do not have a stake so much at the table in the decision.
Yeah, I'm already suspicious.
Yeah, you understand. You know what I mean? You can come in, we say,
yeah,
because you have to make it look good. We have to show equity, equality. So we'll put on a thing, we'll talk to the community, and et cetera, et cetera. And we've done, and the reason I'm saying this from a historical perspective.
You're right.
Yeah,
Political leaders have come and kissed the little black babies.
I want to
They
see
have
what's happening
promised
in
our
Jersey
communities
too,
that
Mo.
we
We're gonna
would
be
do
watching
this.
New Jersey too.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So, and this is not just New Jersey or New York. This is a trend in America. So this is what I'm concerned about when I hear any regulatory committee that's coming from the outside, made up of industry leaders coming to our poor black and brown. We're going to do this and that, et cetera. And so I have to say that. So as we move forward, that's understood.
Totally fair, and I'm no government apologist. We sue the government, so we're you know, I'm all on board with the appropriate degree of skepticism about any government agency. But I will say that, you know, there was a lot of scrutiny as to the appointments to the commission, and we've got
what kind of scrutiny?
Like, you know, there were a lot of eyes on it, and there were people that were observing who was going to be appointed and who's not. And there's a lot of advocacy around it, and the NAACP threatened a lawsuit during the process, and there was a lot of, you know, the ACLU was involved. What's that?
They only threatened? Yeah,
well, there's you know, I won't get into the mud of it right now, but there was a lot, and and the way it resulted, I think is actually really strong, because we've got who I mentioned earlier, Diana Wainu, who's a former ACLU person, Charles Barker, who used to work for, who's a black man who used to work for Senator Cory Booker on his marijuana issues, and we've got so Diana's a black woman, Charles is a black man. We've got 2 Latinx voices and 1 white person. It's a five-person commission. And while, you know, the identities that are represented don't necessarily mean that we're going to achieve justice, you know, it's still a signal that, you know, we're at least a little divorced from, I hope, what in New Jersey used to be a patronage process, because there was a lot of
that. Yeah, there's that in New York too. So
oh yeah, totally, and in New Jersey too. There's, you know, at least there was transparency and scrutiny as to who was getting appointed and why, and we've got a couple of people that have real expertise that are on the commission and not just sort of political hacks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it sounds promising, but I know we still have to stay vigilant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Austin, do you want to give the CLE code?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So the CLE code that you're going to be entering into the form that you get emailed is going to be solidarity. And that's going, I'm going to type it into the chat so that you can see it. It's solidarity without any capitalization. So once you get that email asking you to fill out an evaluation form, we'll also ask you about whether you're seeking CLE credit. And that's when you just type in solidarity.
And I just want to shout out to our audience that if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask the panelists, please put them in the chat or the question and answer section. We have a few minutes left and we can do that if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking. I don't see any questions yet. So what do we think is next?
I'll start real quick and mention 2 things.
Right.
The place, you know, I have a chip on my shoulder about New Jersey being better than New York on everything.
What?
Trust, I lived in New York for 15 years, so I had a chip on my shoulder the other way. But now, you know, I'm all in New Jersey all the time. But let me just say the place where New Jersey falls short in comparison to what New York has done. We don't have in our marijuana legalization scheme the opportunity for home cultivation. And in New York, there is the opportunity for home cultivation for limited amounts for personal use. We think this is a real problem. New Jersey is an outlier. We're the only state that is legalized that doesn't allow for home grow. And you know, we see it as an issue of racial justice and economic justice, right? And of course, healthcare justice, right? There are people that are unable right now to get their medicine, their medical cannabis, because they are immobile, they can't go to the dispensary, or they are priced out of affording the medicine, right? Because we know it's super expensive, insurance doesn't cover it, and the same will be true for adult use recreational cannabis, where people are going to be priced out and they're not going to be able to afford it, and most of those, you know, as I said before, economic status and race are inextricably intertwined, and it's going to disproportionately burden Black and brown people.
But
and we're
should
talking,
it be expensive?
What's that?
Should it be expensive?
Should it be expensive?
Be affordable.
It should be affordable, yeah. But it isn't, and there's going to be there's going to be a lot of conversations as to how expensive it can get, and there's regulations that are going to be drawn about, you know, what the market should look like. But, you know, part of, to your point, Asha, the way you drive down, one of the goals of cannabis legalization in New Jersey was explicitly to drive down the legacy market, to make sure that people who are currently selling marijuana in an unregulated way are no longer able to. And the way they thought about doing that was to try to undercut the legacy market and not make taxes too high, et cetera. And we were like, no, the way you can actually achieve that is by creating meaningful incentives for people who are in the legacy market to actually participate in the regulated market, so that they're not competing with one another, right? Like, let's actually get people who are currently selling cannabis, who have the expertise, who know how to do it, in the regulated market, and be a part of that. And secondly, also make sure that you're encouraging competition, right? Economics 101, right? So the way to keep prices down is to have meaningful competition. And that means not allowing for arbitrary license caps so that only a few can get licenses, and making sure that there's meaningful competition in the industry, so that prices will be kept down. But the next,
let me ask you this: are you allowed to grow marijuana in your house in New Jersey?
No, that's the thing that I was mentioning earlier. We don't have home cultivation in New Jersey, and that's a real problem. And that's where.
Why not?
You know, it's unclear. You know, I think it's historically there was a lot of fear that, you know, allowing for home cultivation is just going to be a backdoor for creating another unregulated market. And then also they were afraid about how it would be enforced. So like, if you're allowed to grow 6 plants at home, how do we know you don't have 7 plants at home? And you know, our answer to that is, how do you know any crime is being committed inside anybody's house, right? Like, you just have to develop corroboration and probable cause and figure it out, and do your police work. Although
that has been disproportionately affecting communities of color, because they're, for some reason, not finding, they never found marijuana above 120, you know, below 125th Street when I was a public defender.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how.
Absolutely, yeah. Stop enforcing it altogether, perhaps. And then the other, you know, less explicit but probably obvious is the industry doesn't want it, right? Like, the industry doesn't want people to be able to grow their own marijuana, because then it drives into their profit margins, right? They will be negatively impacted by it. But luckily, there are you know, other groups out there that are private sector, that you know, do see a benefit. Groups like Scott's Miracle Grow, who wants to encourage home grow because of their business, right? And that is something that's a powerful tool as well. So I think there is a lot of misconceptions in New Jersey about what home grow is and how it can be implemented. Thankfully, in New York, we're going to see home grow. But two more quick things on what's next. So New Jersey has a bill to introduce home grow in New Jersey sometime soon. So now two more things. One is that in New York, now that we have neighboring states, you know, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts all have legalized.
Right.
I think the next obvious thing is to allow for interstate commerce. You know, right now at the federal level, we have a strict prohibition and crossing state lines with cannabis, even from a legalized state to another legalized state,
It's a federal offense, right?
it's a federal offense. And what we should see, we should see federal legalization altogether.
Right.
But if we're taking an incremental approach, one of the things that I would recommend as an obvious next step is interstate commerce between bordering states that have legalized, because that's just inefficient to not have it, right? And from an economic standpoint and from a regional economic growth standpoint, it doesn't make so much sense. And lastly,
one question that's still that's on related to that, and it's the person is asking, and I don't really think there's an answer to this yet, but it could go along with what you're just saying, because cannabis is still illegal on the federal level. There are barriers to legal dispensaries being able to open bank accounts. Do any of the panelists have any thoughts on how to fix that? I mean, that kind of goes along with your statement about interstate commerce, but I mean, I don't have any ideas about it yet, but.
Yeah, there are some state banks or local banks that will support you in this work. You know, I have a funny story about that. We opened, when we were running the ballot committee for the ballot question in New Jersey, you have to open a separate bank account and do all that work. And the place where I won't mention the name of the bank, but the place where we went was a national big bank, right? And they held up our application for a political committee because it had the name cannabis in it. And then we just had to take some steps to fix that, and that was a whole thing. And then there was a bunch of financial transactions that I was unable to make through the bank because the people that we were transacting with had the name cannabis that had the word cannabis in their name. And so, you know, these banks are really, really careful. And we're not talking about cannabis like sellers that were actually in the work. These were advocacy organizations that we were working with that were doing financial transactions with us. So it's a real problem. So hopefully every state will have sort of a cottage industry of banks that can be the providers for their state's cannabis industry. But that speaks to, you know, broader needs for federal legalization, which will allow for banks to get into this work without fearing losing their ability to be banks. You're muted, Asha.
You're muted, Asha. We can't hear you, Asha.
Sure, we can't hear you.
Yes, I got it. So there's one question here, and Theshia can answer it, but so can everyone else. So no one is concerned about marijuana usage in our communities. I mean, I'm personally not, but that's a question that someone from the audience posed.
Well,
so is anyone concerned about marijuana usage in our communities?
Right. And so is it just that legalization is going to lead to an increase in marijuana use?
I mean, presumably that's the question, but they just had that first one. I mean, that'd be the inference, but my personally opinion is that no, because ever since I was a teenager, there's people that's been smoking marijuana around me, and it doesn't influence me one way or the other. And they either smoke or don't smoke. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a full spectrum of use,
right?
You know? And I
know. I'm like, to me, there's no concern. Like, I don't think that just because it's legal now, I don't think people didn't not smoke it when it wasn't legal. They've been smoking it my whole entire life. So I just think now they will continue to smoke it.
Yeah, I think that, and a lot, and I think where that question comes from our the speaker, is probably a lot of what opponents, that messaging that opponents put out there to raise what we call the fear factor. Oh my God, everybody's going to be smoking pot in the streets and passing out and wrecking cars, and that can always stimulate that sense of fear. But I can assure you, just like you may go to the store, ma'am, or whoever asked the question, you see alcohol. I don't think that we ask, oh, is anyone fear someone is going to have a drink? If you drink, you drink, and if you don't, you don't, because that's the way I look at it. I only look at it from a way that something that's already in our communities, and it provides an opportunity, I think, from a legal perspective, for individuals to use it. So I don't think there's going to be an increase. Somebody, people going to say, oh, I can smoke weed now. If they never smoked weed for 30, 40 years of their life, it gets legalized. So, oh, I can smoke weed now, or that won't happen. So I think that that question was posed more from public, that strain that strikes fear into communities. Say, oh my God, if you legalize it, everyone's going to be selling drugs and smoking pot and passed out.
People have been smoking marijuana my whole life, not just in this country. I literally in every other country I've been to, I have smelled marijuana. So they're smoking it all over the world.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, one of the ostensible arguments for the war on drugs was to basically address drug use. And look, drug use rates have just increased with time. And also just looking at the data from like international and the US, drug use patterns don't rise and fall based on how punitive a policy is. So the implication that you reduce the penalties or you eliminate it, all of a sudden you're going to see skyrocketing drug use rates. And then one last thing, in Portugal, the country of Portugal decriminalized possession of all drugs in the early 2000s, I think it was 2001. Right. And in looking at the data, we didn't see any significant increase in drug use rates as a result of decriminalization. So I think the argument that all of a sudden you're going to see a spike in usage rates post legalization or post decriminalization, I mean, the evidence doesn't really support that.
I'll say two quick things just to echo what our friend said here. First is, look, as you guys pointed out, cannabis is already here, right? It's not something new that we're introducing into our society. It's already here. What we are doing, though, is regulating it. And so hopefully people will have access to a better or safer product. And there will actually be more hurdles for young people to get access to it, because now you have to go to a dispensary and have identification and do that. Whereas alternatively, you go to any high school and find it and get it from a drug corner or a corner where there's a drug dealer. Secondly is that if people are concerned, and I think I saw this in one of the questions, if people are concerned about the odor of cannabis and the smoke of cannabis impacting them, I'll say this: in a recent study, it was seen that in states that have legalized, smoking hasn't gone up. It's actually the people have been consuming more through other means that are more accessible, which includes oils and gummies and things like that. So edibles. So I think it's sort of if people are concerned about the smoke itself, that actually may be cured through legalization in some ways, or at least diminished through legalization, because right now all of those different products aren't available in states that haven't legalized.
Right. I think those two questions in Q&A are like basically answered by the things that we just said. But the third question is, now we'll have to see if there's a disproportionate enforcement of driving under the influence. And how do you see occurring, since presently there's no field test for this? I see that as a big issue, because the pretext of stopping someone for the odor of marijuana, I'm just trying to figure out how that's going to work now, because that's not illegal. I guess it's illegal to smoke and drive, but in theory, someone could have smoked before they drove like hours ago and not be affected by marijuana, but that smell does linger. So I don't really know, whoever asked that question, how it's going to work. I do see some problems with that under the VTL. I guess it'll be 1192, 2 or 3 or whatever with the marijuana. I don't know. There's no field test for it. So I don't, at least as far as I know. So we'll have to see. Unfortunately, I hate that answer, but I think it's the true answer.
I'll say this: there is a field test to determine whether or not somebody is driving under the influence, right? Like they may not be able. Yeah, they may not be able to tell that it's under the influence of marijuana, but if they're unfit to drive, you'll be able to know that, right? So, that's where I know maybe. I'm gonna say maybe. But let me just say this: like, if I'm driving in New Jersey and I'm swerving or I'm doing anything that's a problem, I can be pulled over. I can be removed from my vehicle. I can be asked to, it will be uncomfortable and it'll be a terrible interaction, but they can impound my car. They can take me and bring me to the station. The police have all of these powers, some of which I think are far too unchecked and problematic. But the police do have all of these powers to stop that public safety threat.
But they could also presumably stop you if they don't see that, because they have been doing that. They just come up with a pretextual reason.
Right.
So we're saying that, or the person is saying, and I'm based on what I know of the BTL law, how are they going to test for the impairment? I think that marijuana does sometimes, overuse of marijuana does cause impairment, but I don't know physically if it's the same impairment that's caused when you consume alcohol, because there's physical coordination tests. I mean, I don't know, because, you know, that's not my thing. And I definitely don't drive intoxicated in any kind of way, but like, it's conceivable that someone could pass the test, the physical coordination test that they get for alcohol consumption. It's conceivable that they could pass the physical coordination test if they consumed marijuana. And then what is marijuana intoxication? Like, what does that mean? Is it like 1 puff? Is it 2 puffs? Like, what is the intoxication level for marijuana? They didn't really talk about that. So it's weird, because I don't know if they really conceptually conceive of it like that, if they really know the steps that happen when someone stops under, you know, the suspicion of being intoxicated while they're driving.
I think that
we have to figure out.
Yeah, I think that they will probably be able to create a what we like to call a field test that, you know, just like we did with Walk the Line, or some way with, and, you know, for me as an African American, when you say stop by the police, forget the field test and this, I just want to have the test to just getting home. And that's what, I love these conversations, because I think—
Although I would advise you not to. But,
yeah, we talk about it in the ideal America, but as today, as you guys know, with Dante Wright getting gunned down the other day, we can have those, and you can have a person, you know. So I think that when the importance is somehow getting something on paper. I don't know what the hell that means or doesn't mean, particularly for Black and brown communities. Some parameters, some boundaries that protect the lives of those in our community. And I really have to say this: when I hear this, I kind of see the partying people who going out for the night, et cetera. But when we see it in a different light in Black and brown communities, when we talking about the housing projects and you pulling out or you sitting in the car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what does that look like in practical terms? Particularly, and I have to say this, let's not forget, New York, along with Texas and New Jersey, are the 3 states with the highest arrest rates for marijuana in the country. So we know, as Michelle Alexander says, this always evolves into something else.
So that's what we're afraid of, the evolution of this, what it can be, because we don't know. But we have the chance to be vigilant on this now, though. We're catching this in the beginning.
And that's the best part about this whole thing, is that we are truly in the beginning. And I think for New York, as my friend from the, I'm start trying to say her name because I'm a mule, from the Drug Policy Alliance shared, I think that for New York to adopt some of the programs that we see in California to what's happening here in New York, and I think we can kind of piece together a policy program, an equity program that is really innovative and leads the country. And one of the main things I'm going to keep saying, in this perfect world, I really want to hope our legislators will be considering that investment plan, because far too long our communities have not been at the investors' tables with funding that will be granted to them through these loans to act as investors. Asha,
yes,
work with me on that one.
I'm working with you. What do you mean?
Yeah, I hate to be the person to end this discussion.
You don't hate it. I see you.
Because we've got a lot of unanswered questions in the Q&A.
You got to stay tuned for part 2. We'll be back a couple of months.
Thank you, Asha. We will have a part 2 discussion about this, and that's going to talk about the economic opportunities, and it's going to be talking about the regulatory framework for it. We got some questions about banking, and access to funds to start dispensaries. All of those questions are going to be asked, the technical aspects, once the regulatory commission gets in place or the authority gets in place, and we see what actually is going to come out of this. So stay tuned for that. We've got a panel pretty much set for that. We just don't have a date yet because we want more information to come out. I just want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their day on the West Coast, on the West Side in New Jersey, and of course, Professor Coffey, thank you for joining us. And Asha, thanks for moderating as always. The CLE code is there in the chat box. Solidarity, once again, you're going to get an email within 24 hours asking you to fill out an evaluation form. That form is the same form you use for CLE credit. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at the next event, which is May 4th, Justice and Communities of Color Civil Rights Forum with Manhattan DA candidates.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.